Bethany.
And I'm Lauren.
Welcome to the Healing Collective podcast, where we explore the paradox of healing at the individual and the collective level.
Join us as we invite guests to share their personal paths to freedom. You know, we're here to really talk about the paradox of healing. It's a funny way. I like to use our podcast name in a couple ways, like the Healing Collective. And that way we're building a collective of healers. Mm-hmm. And we invite healers to come and speak about their modality for healing and their own healing process. And so we'll start there. And then we'll transition to like, what does that mean for you? And what have you learned about healing the collective?
Got it. Sounds good.
So how do you tell us about your healing, your medicine? Who are you as a healer in the world?
Yeah. I think, as a healer in the world, what I've come to understand about myself is I can create and co-create sacred spaces, environments, and conditions where people feel really comfortable being vulnerable and open and honest, while also feeling some rigor and feeling some fire and feeling like an invitation to be called higher into their best selves. It's something I've been doing since I was a little girl. And just realized really what it was later in life. And the way it's manifesting now is as coaching, whether that's one-on-one coaching or group coaching. I'm both a leadership and spiritual life coach. And so I weave in and out constantly of like spirit world, human world. I just believe our growth is, from the inside out. And so that's typically how I flow. I drop into a zone and just provide a space for people to do their own healing.
Can you say a little bit about a spiritual life coach? Because a lot of people are probably familiar with sort of more professional coaching. And then, in Lauren and I's modality, it's wrapping everything in there, but it's still like focused on organizations and stuff. So I'm interested in, I don't know what you mean. What's a spiritual?
Yeah. When I say that, I really just mean a coaching modality that's really grounded in spiritual principles. And so I did go to a spiritual life, coaching certification program, and I'm in a beautiful community of other spiritual life coaches. And really, it's a fundamental belief that we're spiritual beings first and human beings second. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of my coaching, whether I'm weaving in and out of executive coaching, leadership coaching, or spiritual life coaching, what I notice, especially in leaders, because I tend to focus really on people who consider themselves leaders, and are leading people or organizations or movements, what I notice about leaders, it's those leaders that we consider great or those that like call us higher are the ones who are in a constant practice of making sure their true selves, their spirit selves are in the driver's seat and their personalities are in the passenger seat. Oftentimes we're not conscious, it's the other way around. Our personalities, our egos are in charge. And when we're in ego state, as we all know, when we're in ego state, we're oftentimes in fear state and we're making scarce kind of decisions and we're making forced binary decisions when, our true self is in front, where we see more possibility. We see multiple perspectives. We see multiple truths. And so really, it's just recognizing in the openness of how, we're both equal parts broken and whole. We're both equal parts human and spiritual. And it's beyond any kind of denomination or religion or anything like that. It's just a recognition of a higher force, a higher power greater than us, no matter what you call it.
I like that. What comes to mind for me is, so I'm in the somatic experience practitioner training. It's a 3-year training. Mm-hmm. And my therapist, Kathy Latner, she comes up probably every session, but every podcast we do sessions. These are sessions, but
mine comes up.
She talks about like how a lot of the coaching stuff that Lauren and I do is like personality work, and maybe even traditional talk therapy, and sort of like what are my patterns and who am I in this lifetime, and like on top of that, like outside and above that is sort of this like who your higher self and even your spirit guides and all these other more esoteric elements. And then underneath that is the body. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, if you have trauma or reactivity and you get overwhelmed, like you don't even have access to do personality work. So I am excited about learning the SE modalities and using them in coaching, because sometimes, we'll touch on something that someone kind of gets overwhelmed or becomes unavailable. And so being able to ground them and let their body do what it wants to do and complete, or whatever, whatever that thing is. And the people that I've been working with SE lately, a lot of them are like, I'm thinking one woman particularly, she's done a ton of, I think, some of the work you're pointing to, like spiritual work. And she hasn't done the body, and she's almost ungrounded. Like she's way up here, and she's like dropping into journeys in the middle of sessions, and there's spirits talking to her in the middle of the thing. And like, she's got all of this access. And then there's this other part where she's like untethered. And so I think it's interesting to think about, what's essential work look like, and how do you integrate all those things into practices, so they're in balance, I guess.
Yeah. Mind, body, spirit connection is everything. And that's why I love coaching so much, because coaching as a methodology truly is about going in and out of all those domains and being really present to where people's bodies are, where they are emotionally, where they are spiritually, where they are physically. And to me, that's really how people shift and change their values, which then changes their behaviors, which then shifts their relationships, which then shifts their outcomes and, what they're trying to get out of their lives. And so to me, it kind of takes the theory part and really puts it in practice. I've always been about action and, how different things that we learn about ourselves, and different things we learn about our lives can impact how we experience each other and experience our work.
Yeah, I want to go a little woo-woo for a second, because this is a conversation I've been having all week, which is, and it's been informed by other people. This is not just my idea, but this general idea that consciousness is evolving very quickly. And in the past, consciousness could use this experience on Earth as like a Vegas experience. Like, I'm going to come in and I'm going to just like be Westworld. I'm just going to have whatever experience I want to have here, but I'm going to leave before I'm not going to get fully embodied, because that I don't have to feel the consequences of whatever I create. And I'm going to leave, right? And just keep coming back and then leave when I feel like it, to not really have the full human experience. And I have a sense that we're at a time in kind of, if we want to say, in multidimensional history, not just Earth history, where I don't think consciousness is allowed to do that anymore. I think there's like a coming in and choosing to commit to the body and commit to facing the karma of all the times that you've chosen to be here or not be here. And when I have clients like what you're pointing to, Bethany, a lot of times, and this was actually pointed out to me in one part of my healing, it's like, you haven't committed to being here. And when you came in, there was probably lots of trauma in your body. Your body was at a fear vibration. You could feel the generational trauma and all the things that you were going to have to face as a result of all this buildup over generations. And you were like, I'm out. But you're still kind of tethered. And so there's this like asking people or consciousness to say, like, will you be committed to be here, which is taking responsibility for not just what you do in this life, but also what lives in your body that wants to complete while you're here. I'm curious what you think about that.
Oh, you said so much. I have a lot of thoughts. Oh my goodness, a lot of thoughts. One connection I made, I have a spiritual teacher who also was coaching me around staying here for not just my children. So I didn't even have that awareness that, I was really, here, tethered here, all the way present when it came to my children. I was all in, I was all vulnerable. I mean, all the way in, but I wasn't truly all the way in and committed in all parts of my life. And it was through that work and this wasn't that long ago. This must've been like 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm sure, not ironically, it was the same time I was kind of having this reckoning with Teach to Lead, with the organization, and really figuring out like, what is mine to do? And I fell out of love with it. And it scared me because I started it and it was my livelihood, but it was so hard to get up and do every day. And then, did some work and realized that, I was really at that point, just really here for my children. And I think that through that kind of self-discovery and doing my own healing work around that and realizing, oh, it's not actually the work. Yes, I get triggered just like anybody else doing really tough racial equity work. It was how I was doing it that had to shift. I was in a different place. I was breaking open, but my work wasn't. And that was like, and I feel like, that's just a very tiny microcosm to what you were talking about that's happening now globally, which is like, we are being forced to recognize everything that's happening. Everything's crumbling. So many different things are crumbling for a reason. Sometimes in order for your heart to heal, it has to break all the way. And things are breaking all the way. And I was so frustrated about things breaking in my own life. And I was just kind of fleeing in different ways. But it wasn't until I stopped and looked at it from multiple perspectives, the same thing I do for other folks. I leaned on my people to help me do it for me. And I went, oh, and I saw all these other different paths to do this work. And on a larger scale, globally, we have to figure out different ways to do life. Like life, the way we've been doing it has not been working for so many different people. There's no such thing as normal. There's no such thing as going back. We are in this beautiful space of the divine feminine rising. And, different energies falling away, other energies moving forward. And I think really it's a calling for balance because we've just been so imbalanced for so long. And I saw that in my own life and, with what was happening. And the more that I move towards ease and balance, I'm finding that things are just kind of falling into place. I'm in my flow. And I notice that with my clients, once I provide that space for them to come to their own awareness and consciousness of how they're doing different things to avoid pain or avoid fear. Once they face it, it's never as scary or as big as they anticipated. And then they're able to see several paths, not just one, from where they are to where they want to be. And it's just a matter of like really getting introspective about the patterns that are at play and making a new choice and really committing. I was here, but I wasn't necessarily committing. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I always choose a different spiritual principle to focus on every single year. And last year was actually commit. And it was commit because of that awareness of like, I'm halfway committing or I'm, partially committing. I'm all the way committing to my children, but where else am I not fully committing? And so last year was and it was 2020. Was an incredible year. It was the year I started Shayna Renee, my coaching practice for Black women, and fully committed to doing this kind of work in a different way with women I absolutely adore and love, and who can fully see me as well and receive all the medicine, right? And so 2020 was actually an amazing transformative year for me in that way. And it was transformative for all of us in a lot of different ways, painful ways, big ways, small ways. But I do think that that's just the vibration that we're in right now. It's really a calling to wake up and remain in awakened state because so many of us have been sleepwalking for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a word, like, especially around being committed just for your kids. Mm-hmm. Like I, for me, in my spirit, where over here is like that I have been committed to being here for other people. And I have not fully made the choice that I would be here if they weren't here or however you want to look at it. It's like, I am here because of them. And it's interesting because at this award ceremony, this woman that I know from growing up, her daughter was killed. And then this other woman, her son and her husband were killed. And I remember when those things happened to them. And I was sitting in the award ceremony like, I wouldn't survive. I'd leave. I'd be gone. Yeah. And so now, I'm hearing this message right here. So that was a word. And then I just think that this word commitment, for me, words are representations of energies. Mm-hmm. And I think we can get so caught up in the language, right? Because of how we've defined it. But to me, commitment it's an energy that you give something. It is. And it just has a different texture than other words and ways of being that we could choose.
Yeah, I agree. I so agree. And you're reminding me of different coaching sessions with different clients where they they come with different dilemmas, and they are definitely complex, but they're expecting a very complex, quote unquote, answer or way through. And usually it's a decision. It's a decision and a commitment to that decision that they just haven't made, or they halfway made it. And once they fully commit, things just like part and they're able to move through. And it speaks to that energy. When we really truly commit 100% to something or someone or some principle, the universe responds and comes right with us, because our hearts are in it, our whole bodies, everything's in it.
What do you think's more powerful, committing or the awareness that you weren't committed, even though you thought you were? Because I find in my coaching, if someone's not committed to not doing something, me asking them to commit, like, usually doesn't change very much. Like, they're where they are at, but sometimes the awareness of actually owning, oh, I'm saying I'm committed to that, but actually I'm not. I wasn't paying any attention to all this evidence. Do you notice anything about that, or what's your experience around that?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's the same experience. Before the commitment comes the awareness that they weren't committed. And that's what's so deep for them, is like noticing first, I thought I was committed, or I'm committed I'm saying one thing, but I'm actually committed to the exact opposite, because of look how, I'm living my life, I'm spending my money, I'm managing people. It's very different from what I think or say or declare that I'm committing to. But the power is in realizing, like, oh, I'm actually really not all that committed to that. And then the deeper layer, why, what's in the way of you committing fully? And maybe there's a recommitment or a new, commitment that you need to make.
In the conscious leadership group model, it's sort of like, we just say, what are your results? That's what you're committed to. So if you say, I want to blah, 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 whatever, if your results don't show that, that's not what you're committed to. You're unconsciously committed to doing whatever your results are. And once we start to wake up to it all and own all of our results, then that seems to be the place of agency that people decide to do different things sometimes.
Yeah, I experienced that as well.
I think for me, one piece too, I guess I'm thinking about people listening, is that there's kind of this way, and maybe we could say it's like part of patriarchy and white supremacy, even, like, where it's like, discipline yourself to be committed, like, if you wake up to the fact that you're not committed, or you're committed to unavailable people or whatever, like, just make a different choice, just get committed over here, And as someone who that strategy has never worked.
No.
One, there's so much just around holding the field of love as a coach and and then learning to hold it individually, that the self-acceptance of facing is something that's tolerable, right? Where the shame is not so overwhelming that you can't move through and just accept, this is where I am. And yes, I can intend to commit or hope for something towards the future, but I want to say require, like, part of it is the path from my commitment now to what it's going to take for me to have that thing in the future.
Yeah, it's definitely a journey. I mean, I think about my own journey to get to a new commitment in my first business. I mean, that took 2 years. It took 2 years of really digging deeply into why I was experiencing the disconnect and why I wasn't really ready to fully commit. I mean, it was layered. And, and what's also kind of in between acceptance and a new commitment is forgiveness, is first self-forgiveness, and just like really having that self-compassion to just say, this is why, I am where I am, and I forgive myself for that, and I can definitely see why I'm, only tethered here because of my children, or, I choose not to kind of focus on my generational healing that I know I'm also here for. It's just giving yourself that grace, giving yourself that forgiveness and that love, and allowing it to take as long as it needs to take in order for that new commitment and that new way of being or leading to surface. And just being in that constant, I often talk about being in that constant state of surrender. And so I think the difference between like a commitment through like a patriarchal or white supremacist lens is more kind of manipulative. It could be controlling, it could be demanding. When I think about it through a liberatory lens, it's really an allowing, it's a surrendering. It's trusting that the divine right time will come when it's time to make a certain pivot, when it's time to make a new commitment, and trusting it'll come right on time, and that you have everything and everyone you need in order to rise to it.
When I think about that grace piece, something that's really I've been kind of facing recently, like just to have a concrete example for listeners, is the way that sugar is marketed to my realities in such intense ways, and how it's everywhere, right? And so if I'm making a commitment, which I am right now, to really lower my sugar intake, like there is a lot of self-compassion of how much, I don't want to say it's fully out of my control, but just the inundation of kind of the collective conscience, the matrix, or just capitalism that is in my face. And I see how much sometimes this idea of like personal responsibility, there's like a right relationship to it, right? Because there's so many things that create us to struggle with the things that we struggle with.
Yep.
And so we can step into personal responsibility in to a certain extent. And that's important, moving from like kind of a victim consciousness into understanding your agency, but also there's also some real facing of how big and powerful the collective is in impacting those personal choices and commitments.
Yeah. It's a lot of the work that I do in both businesses. So, I call the white supremacy culture that we're all swimming in, I call that the sick collective consciousness. And we're all healing from it. No matter what our background may be, we're all in a constant state of separating our own consciousness from the sick collective consciousness. And yes, the sick collective consciousness is all wrapped up in patriarchy and white supremacy. And because it's all wrapped up, we have to constantly be in a state of surrender and really in a commitment to our consciousness, and really just like constantly, being curious about why we're making the kind of decisions that we're making in a non-judgmental way, and really allowing different things to come in. And that's why, at my core, I know that who I am and what I'm here for are the same things, and that's love and liberation. I mean, that's just kind of who I am. And people sometimes look at me and think and say, wow, Shayna, you're so disciplined. And I don't think anyone is really disciplined. I'm just anchored and aligned in who I am. And so my decisions are coming out of when I'm conscious and when I'm anchored, I really make a commitment to love and liberation. That's my commitment. And, my food choices to my leadership choices, they come out of those main two principles and those two values. And that's what guides my life. And that's what I help guide clients around, is really to gain an awareness around, what are those guiding values for you? What really matters to you when you just rip off all the roles that you play in life? Who are you at your core? And it's when we continually do that work, it helps us stay the course on different things that are related to those values. And that's what can appear as disciplined, or, consistent, et cetera.
I'm thinking about what you're saying, Lauren, about like, where is the line of personal responsibility and things we don't have control over? And we could really go in a rabbit hole, like deciding where responsibility lays and all that kind of thing. And what I notice is like a distinction in my capacity. So like, I think the more trauma that lives in your body, you don't have as much capacity to take as much agency and personal responsibilities, and I've noticed so much more capacity in me, and me being able and willing and doing fine with taking more and more and more responsibility as I've been doing a lot of healing work and really focused on that almost.
Yeah.
And because everyone's going to have a different experience, right? Like somebody might be like, somebody's experience of being inundated with sugar ads or whatever, and like, seeing treats and sweets and it being offered everywhere you go, like two people could have really different experiences about how much influence that has over them, right? So individualized to one's experience. So it's like feels not black and white.
Not at all.
Well, one thing I'm thinking about when Shayna, what I hear you talking about is something I call energetic integrity. It's like your core has values and purposes that it came here with. And once it understands what those principles and values are, and its life is a reflection and aligned to that, to your point, I don't think it's a discipline. It's just flow, because you're in alignment, you're congruent with yourself. And I'm curious if you'd be willing to talk about, I mean, maybe you were just born that way, like that congruent, but I imagine that part of your healing journey has led you to that congruent. So are there specific, I don't know, want to say situations or things that brought you to that congruence in your healing journey?
Oh my goodness, so many different situations. I'll start probably with, my childhood. So I'm a survivor of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. And it was in the home and with people that, you're supposed to kind of trust. And so I learned very early on that people are broken, all of us. And so my kind of orientation to age was definitely different for most people. My orientation to safety, my orientation to trust was tested at a very, very, very young age. And so what that also meant was my capacity was limited from a very, very young age. And I didn't get any kind of formal help or anything like that until I was in college. It was the first time I went to therapy. It was the first time I really started to kind of reckon with all of that I experienced and all of what it meant for who I am and how I experienced. But the paradox in it all, though, at the end of the day, through lots of work, since then, what I also realized is that at my core, whether those things happen to me or not, I'd still be the same person. I might show up a little differently. It might manifest a little differently, but I've always been love and liberation. I would have been that no matter what trial or tribulation that I went through. And so much of my healing work was about understanding that and truly embodying that, physically and emotionally, not just intellectually. Because for so long, I was my circumstance. I thought I was anyway. I thought that so much was born out of that. I went through different stages. There were the stages of shame, of course. And then there were the stages of pride that, look at me, I got through this and I didn't become a statistic. There are all these stages. And what I realized was that it was a circumstance. And it was very unfortunate. And there have been many other unfortunate circumstances. I'm a Black woman. We have a lot of them. And that's a part of my human experience. It's part of my personality. It's a part of the conditions, my environment. But me and my core, that hasn't changed. That was, formed before I even came here. And so that also helps me keep myself grounded and lets me know where my true power comes from. Because sometimes and I've noticed where in different clients and in myself, when I thought my power was coming from my trials and my pain, while yes, I learned a lot from my pain, and yes, it's helped me really see people probably more fully, and my gifts manifest in different ways in terms of really being able to sense things. At the same time, I'm love and liberation. And I would have found some sort of way to be that if I had made the choice and committed to that, right? So my commitment did come through a lot of pain, and it came through a lot of trying to heal through different circumstances I shouldn't have had to deal with, and dealt with racism, just like any Black-bodied person, and a lot of marginalized people, have dealt with a lot of both explicit and implicit biases and racism. My first day of school in an all-white school was very traumatic. Students didn't allow me to sit down, called me nigger, called me monkey, called me all kinds of things. And so again, while there was definitely pain and sadness and anger in that very moment, there also was this curiosity and this like, what makes people act like this? A question I always asked myself as a small child was, what is this what life's about? Like, what is life really all about? I always had this curiosity about what is life about, because in my experience, I was like, because it can't be this. Like, this can't be life. Like, this ain't it. Like, I don't know what it is, but this ain't it. And I want to find out what life really is and what it's supposed to be. I always kind of had this knowing that folk around me, a lot of folk were operating out of something that just wasn't real and wasn't the thing. And then through my own journey, realized like, oh, there's a sick collective consciousness that is definitely at play. That's just the air that we breathe, that's inviting all kinds of folks to act in ways that are out of alignment with their true selves. And it's manifesting as abuse, as racism, as all isms. And it's a big lie. And so, decided to spend my life, the rest of my days, now that I have this awareness, calling people in to discover it for themselves and, really discover what modality is going to work for them in the spaces that I co-create.
And how would you answer that question to your little girl self now? Like, what is life about? What would you tell her?
Oh my goodness. I would tell her, first and foremost, life is about healing. Like, it just is. Whether you're healing from a very particular painful, abuse, or whether you're healing from self-hatred, whether you're healing from, I don't know, a food addiction or other kind of addiction. We're always in a constant state of healing ourselves, learning about ourselves, while also we're here to thrive. Like, we are here to be in a state of joy. We are also we are emotional beings for a reason. And we're here to really fill that up and experience the full range of emotions. And that's probably the biggest, most painful, I think, regrettable lie of the sick collective consciousness, is that we're here to just work and produce. We are here to enjoy, to be, in the biggest expression of joy that we could possibly, be. And so to me, that's what life's about. And we get to figure out what that means and what that looks like for us.
I hear just the threads I hear in everything you say is basically a rejection of victim consciousness. You're like, not for me.
Nope.
While acknowledging life happens and things happen, not, in a very practical and realistic experience of it. And also this love and liberation, you're so crystal clear on what you're standing for and what you're here for and what your work is. And I'm wondering, when did you become aware of that? What was the story of how you came into that? When did you know? And how did you know?
I can't pinpoint an exact time. I get asked that question a lot. I will say a time period. So there was a period of time, I would say, in between, I'm a former principal. It was after the principalship. And it was around the time, actually, I started Teach to Lead. I think there's something about when I really started my own thing and had my own agency. I wasn't working for anyone. I had just more room and more space to design my days. I started prioritizing my self-care more. I started going to acupuncture. I started, really working with a shaman around that time. And I grew so much. I learned about my own spiritual gifts. I learned that I'm a seer. I learned how powerful my intuition is and how powerful everyone's intuition is, and how really it's about turning inward. And I learned so much about the different ways also in which that I had betrayed myself, and how my trauma invited me to make decisions that were not incongruent with what I really wanted. So it was really, I'd say, over a course of maybe, 6 to 7 years or so of just coming into myself. And it was really through working with clients. I would get lots of feedback and noticing the consistency and feedback that I would get from clients over and over and over and over and over again. When I would go into a space with my team and we would do racial equity work, we would always get, we've done this work before so many times, but never this way. And I would ask, what do you think that is? And they were just like, it's your articulation, I think, of love. Like you not only articulate it in a particular way, but like I can feel it. And I think that was a result of the work that I've been doing and been committing to for so long, and learning that my presence truly is enough. Like when we get to a place where we're so aware of our core, people feel that, you just emanate it and people rise to it. And I noticed that regardless of whether I'm in a room with 2 people or whether I'm in a room with 500 people, people tend to feel it. And once I started getting that very direct feedback kind of about that pattern, I was like, oh, it's definitely love. And liberation, of course, is everything. It's just something that I just discovered through my own work and journey, through my therapist, through my coach, and through my shaman.
It's like it sounds like a weaving of, I'm going to do this because it feels aligned. And then people being like, this is who you are. It's like this confirmation over
yes,
and over.
correct. You are on the right path.
Exactly.
Keep moving.
We've both talked about that too, like feedback from people. Sometimes the things that you're the best at, you don't even know because it's come so naturally to you that you don't really see it. And so getting feedback from somebody who's like, this is your genius area. You're good at it. Like, wow, you really can do that. Can be so helpful.
It can be very helpful. And especially when we get out of the cycle of the sick collective consciousness of just looking at the negative and focusing on our deficits and what we need to grow on. It's when I gave myself permission to really listen to and take in and receive the positive and what people were getting, that helped me understand, like, oh, this is my jam.
I have a question I'd love to hear your thoughts around. So, in the consciousness community in general, I would say, right, there's a continual conversation about victim consciousness and the role that it plays, right? Mm-hmm. And we have this experience all the time in our work where there are like actual victims, right? So there's this bypass that can, in my opinion, it's a bypass. I'm curious what you would say about it. Is like, well, you're just in victim consciousness. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like when you share that thing or that piece, or even relationally, like sometimes in the tools that Bethany and I use, I was dealing with this relationship thing this week with a couple people that needed coaching. And there's this attitude, like, you just need to like get out of victim consciousness and do your thing and take responsibility. And you need to get out of victim, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I can see what you're saying. Also, you're like, I'm not living in victim consciousness. So how do you make that make sense in your reality?
Oh my goodness. So many things there. There's a difference between being victimized and being in a victim consciousness. And sometimes we conflate those two things. People are truly, it is a fact to be victimized. And that's why I actually don't ascribe to and don't talk about story, because that can be very triggering for people, especially people who are a part of marginalized groups who have experienced various levels of abuse, various levels of discrimination and marginalization. And it's extremely painful. And to be told that's a story can be really detrimental.
Like gaslighting almost.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And what has to be affirmed is that, yes, in certain circumstances, they have been victimized. And that needs to be affirmed and explored and discussed. And then exploring and discussing how they are seeing what healing looks like for them in that particular arena. And I think that sometimes, with the best of intentions, sometimes practitioners can inadvertently shame them for kind of being in that gap between healed from a particular situation and trying to make sense of it and trying to, heal their bodies through it, even understand how their body is reacting to it. And then getting into that emotional space of like, okay, how am I making sense of this? What are the various multiple truths happening at this time? But I find that oftentimes people are better able to see multiple perspectives and truths when their personal truth and experience has been affirmed. And so I'm very careful about that word, and really careful to, distinguish between victimized and victim consciousness, because those are very different things. And it's a very human response and reaction when you've been victimized, of course, to feel defeated and to feel like your agency has been challenged or taken, because that's actually what happens to a lot of people. And so I think that's important to have that truth while also then deciding and exploring, okay, what does this mean about my core and who I am? And what value about me am I going to really put to the forefront to help me through this, and to give me my agency and my power back. And so we talk about this a lot within my Indigo Women community, within my coaching practice. I call it going from leading from the margins to leading from the center. And the leading from the center is just what I'm describing, which is getting back to your core, to who you are, regardless of what setback that you're, accessing or experiencing at the time. What are those values? How do you want to use your voice? How do you want to reposition your voice? And what's your compelling why? What about you and your journey, your ancestry? What ancestors are you going to call upon? I think it's really important to spend a lot of time going back to that core, to that center, while also affirming what has happened.
I want to share a story related to that, which is Beth, I think I told Bethany this. I don't think I've told you, but so I'm back in my house that I grew up in high school. I'm in a bedroom that I didn't ever really live in necessarily, because I was out. Once I left, I was just out. And so now that I'm staying here for a few months at least, there's no drawers that are available. So my mom used my room for all the costumes that have ever existed in our family. And I'm sitting there
talking about something esoteric or a metaphor. No, they have a room full of costumes at this house. It made me she had to say 3 times. I was like, well, how do you have so many costumes? But that's that's literal. This is not a Lauren.
Straight up costume.
And as I'm digging through costumes, underneath they're old journals from when I was 0 to 10 years old. And I had this moment and I'm like, oh my God, this is the work I've been doing for the last 15 years, is cleaning out all the costumes and all the parts that aren't me. And here I am coming back to my center, to my core. And so I'm actually when I hear you talk about your center and knowing who you are, and I am love and liberation, I feel like I'm just, I see a foot tiptoeing in water. I'm oh, I am really just, not that it's not always there, but my awareness is coming in congruency with oh, who am I underneath all of those things that happened to me, that took me in this other direction. And I was asking okay, Shayna's I am love and liberation. And I'm what would be my 2 words? What would they be? And I was I am freedom and grace. Those were the 2 words that came up for me.
Mm-hmm. You just smiled. Look at you, opened up when you said that. Freedom. Yeah. And that's how it feels, and what I often say is it should feel like a hug. It's oh, I just hugged myself.
I really get that energetically. It should feel like a hug.
It should feel like a hug. And then it just really helps with different setbacks, things that inevitably are going to happen, because so many of us are, battling the sick collective consciousness.
I want to, I have so many things. I'm have little notes coming up. So you got to just interrupt me, Bethany, or something. But the other day we were teaching and you were giving this explanation about emotional intelligence. And I was I've never heard that before. Because you remember you were talking about like social awareness used to be this and now it's this. And I was like, oh my God, like no wonder we're so fucked up. And so anyways, I would love for you to give some background about one, your passion about emotional intelligence and your training. And then I'd love to kind of hear about that transition from how we used to define it to how we're redefining it.
Yeah. So another common thread that has been around for the past almost 9 years of doing my work now on my own has been emotional intelligence. I believe emotional intelligence is the muscle we're flexing when we're leading and teaching people who are different from us. And there are 4 domains, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And, this body of work is about 30 plus old. I am a huge supporter of Daniel Goleman. I'm a part of his faculty, and I train and also certify coaches globally in emotional intelligence coaching through his program, and have a lot of respect for the work. And like a lot of work built 30 years ago, it was built through one lens, through a very white dominated lens with amazing intentions. And there were some gaps. I noticed some gaps. There were things about it that just weren't working for me. They weren't working for my clients. And over the years, I just found myself tweaking things to really better fit not only marginalized people, but where we are in our world for all people. And so, for example, relationship management, when it talked about conflict, the language it was all around disarming conflict, calming conflict, making conflict go away. What we've all learned a lot is that some of our best solutions, some of our deepest, most authentic relationships come out of productive conflict. And so I took it upon myself to rewrite it to engaging healthy conflict. And so many of us, especially who are experiencing this world on the margins, oftentimes we are the ones who are engaging it because our perspectives are likely and oftentimes much different than the white dominant group. And so just our very existence sometimes can be met with resistance, can be met with false, feelings of being threatened, intimidated, et cetera. And it's really important that we're all in this space of inviting conflict, inviting diverse perspectives, inviting dissent, because that is exactly what we need to make sure we're making decisions that are out of our true consciousness and not of the sick collective. Sick collective consciousness is all about, fear of conflict, false niceness, and really just keeping, status quo and different power structures in place, which is not working for everyone. So that's one way, one piece. I shifted all 4. When it comes to social awareness at its core, what's behind it is empathy, which is so beautiful and so needed. And it's about how you see not only your own emotions, but it's about how you see the emotions of others and how you read a room and how you make adjustments based upon that data that's happening in front of you. Instead of just being an observer, you're like, well, how can we take this deeper? How can we pull this, this person's voice or perspective in? And so I added that piece about being really also keenly aware of different people's perspectives. And what perspective are you not hearing? That's probably one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves as leaders is who's not in the room and what aren't we hearing or saying? And so I added that piece to social awareness. And then self-management was all about managing your emotions, right? And it's related to stress and relieving stress, of course, but self-management is more than managing emotions. We are being called to experience our emotions, our full range of emotions, especially for people who are marginalized. We get all kinds of messages that we are to assimilate to white dominant culture, to sick collective consciousness in order to gain any kind of ounce of power. And that is debilitating and exhausting, and it strips us of our agency to be authentic. And so self-management has to be a call for everyone to experience the full range of emotions, which also means we have to be ready to receive other people's full range of emotions, which gets into fragility and other manifestations of fear of all kinds of emotions. And so I rewrote that so that in hopes, right, that we build better conditions and cultures within organizations that everyone's able to bring their full self to work and to do what they need to do. And then self-awareness. So self-awareness was really about, in its early stages, about emotional awareness, right? And a little bit of body awareness. And also the flip side, how those emotions impact other people. What I added into that, it's not just our emotions that we also need to be aware of. We need to be aware of our biases, our privileges, and how systemic racism and patriarchy impact us and how it's gotten seeped into us. No matter what our background is, it's seeped into us in some way, shape, or form. And it's up to us to be in a constant state of awareness around how that manifests in us and how we are unknowingly transferring that to other people. So when we talk about self-awareness, we can't just talk about emotions. We're in a place in our world where we have to also talk about what's impacting those emotions, what systems are in place, and especially as leaders, what's our responsibility for reconstructing conditions such that we can even become more aware of what's going on within us and around us.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most transformative things ever was when I went to the KIPP Foundation training, which now I'm like, did you write that? Because I know you were part of designing that. Was they define self-awareness as how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you.
Right.
And I remember just having this awakening and going back, and it was my first year's principal, and we all know how that went. Not great, And I sat down with all my teachers and I said, instead of doing any of your performance review, I actually just want you to tell me how you experienced me, the school, everything. Mm-hmm. Just made myself available in a way I'd never had before. And the things they told me, I'm like, the things they thought I cared about, the things they thought I valued were so off from how I was perceiving my leadership, how I was perceiving myself. And it was a drastic awakening. And then from then on, like my practice of like looping with other people and how they're experiencing me has been vital to my self-awareness.
Yeah, big time. And that piece was a part of the original, construction of of self-awareness. It always was about the two sides, right? How I perceive myself and how others perceive me. That's of the original version. And, research says 75% of us overestimate our self-awareness because we oftentimes it's how we're perceived where we're way off. Because think about it. I mean, when was the last time you asked, for genuine feedback? Is it a practice? Is it not? That's something I work on with my leaders a lot is, how often are you asking? Because, it takes a few times for people to actually know that it's safe. And it's safe to actually share and that you actually really do want it and not for, another reason. And it's those cultures where, leaders do that continually. They tend to see amazing outcomes and more importantly, they enjoy their work more.
Lauren and I might be odd ducks because we're constantly creating feedback-rich environments. But one of the places I found this the most challenging was I started asking my kids for feedback on my parenting.
Yeah.
And it's those things that they say.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, and that's like right at the core. It's really vulnerable. And it's definitely one of the things I get triggered about still is like, am I a good mom and all that sort of stuff. So, but man, when I can get present enough to just listen to what they're saying, like they know better than anybody.
Yes, they do.
And you don't know what you don't know. Like you could be thinking you're doing something and someone can experience it totally differently. And the only way you know is if you ask. So
yeah.
Luckily my children have no problem delivering feedback to me. So they were not concerned that I couldn't handle it. So at least that's something.
Good thing. Yeah.
But also, go ahead, Shayna.
I was just going to say, I get unsolicited feedback from them all the time.
Well, it also speaks to, I think about power dynamics and authority. And like the relationship I had with my parents is if I gave them feedback, it would be considered disrespectful.
Yep.
When I was a principal, like we had a whole season of like moving that it was that way. And we tried to transition to something different and really being available to loop. And I think, at least for me in my actual growth, where I am right now is recognizing I've almost looked for feedback so much that I can gaslight myself when I feel like something else energetically. And so it's interesting because, now to think about that experience, which was like 15 years ago with my staff, and then to be now like, okay, now I'm actually kind of going back and looping to like, well, what is my truth? What are my values? What is going to be true for me? Even when people give me feedback and they are having experience, what am I willing to change about myself or adjust around that? And what am I not? So that's a really interesting experience I'm having right now.
And I suppose there's also a way where people can give you feedback that's completely about them and not actually about you, depending on what the experience is. So how do you navigate that nuance? And towards the end of my marriage, I was taking pieces of feedback and being like, how is it true? That was like actually just not.
It's so hard. I mean, you're both dancing around discernment. It's all about discernment. And that's why self-awareness is so important. Like, I get better and better at, discerning what's for me and what's not, what's projection. And sometimes it takes a little while to kind of sit with it. Whenever I get into a place where I get in this loop, and I see my clients sometimes get in this loop where, and I kind of heard this possibly with you, Lauren, where you tend to take on too much responsibility. And when I find myself taking on too much responsibility for a certain piece of feedback and I'm like obsessing about it, usually that's indication that some of it may be true, but some of it probably isn't for me or even about me. And I just need to let some of that go. Because something I know to be true about myself is that I'm reflective. I love, I'm growth oriented. And so whenever something is like, oof, like really rough, I really pay attention to it. And then sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes it really is something that's squarely in my blind spot that I have to work on. But it's tough. And especially as, someone when you're a part of many also marginalized groups, it's even harder because you don't know what is fear-based at times or about someone else's kind of, wrestling with their own comfortability and confidence with working with people who are different from them. And so it's sometimes hard to decipher what's mine, what's yours. Okay, I think I'm receiving what's mine. And something I always say is like, eat the meat, throw out the bones. And I constantly search for the meat. I believe there's meat everywhere. Even in, feedback that may come from someone who's narcissistic or something like that. There's something to be learned from everyone. And it's about just kind of being aware and open for whatever that lesson is. And sometimes the lesson is just to dismiss it.
I like boiling it to discernment and the continuum that is discernment, right? And like how there's, we add emotional intelligence. Once we're more emotionally intelligent, it expands our discernment. Once we trust our intuition more, it expands our range of discernment. And just like what a practice that is over the course of our life, and that we can, I guess I'm saying this more to myself, we can only discern from the place that we are in that moment and the awareness that we are at that moment.
That's all you can do.
That's that brings it back to where we were about acceptance. Like, we do the best we can in that moment and not to beat ourselves up for like maybe being unconsciously committed to the thing we said we didn't want and being able to have our heart be open to ourselves and then just go on and do the next thing and maybe create something different from there. But
and to like this piece of kind of how we're collectively accountable and also being available for that at the same time. I think that's such a, like when you teach these things, because the brain wants to make it so dualistic and compartmentalized, people will be like, well, which one is it? You know what I mean? Should I have grace and acceptance for everything I do? And like, never feel bad, or, it's just, that's what the brain wants to do. It's just like, and that's why I like this idea of discernment as a continuum, because, when you first learn about personal responsibility, you're probably going to do a lot of taking responsibility, and then that becomes a muscle, and then maybe that softens and you do a little bit more and less of that. And so it's such a dance, and I think our minds try to make it like a rule.
Yeah.
Did you guys see that movie Lady in the Water?
No.
I only bring it up because there's this silly character that only worked out the right side of his body. So like this arm's like real skinny and this arm's like super muscly, and the same for that leg. And he's just like on this, only works out this one side, like this quirky character in the film. And I just thought about that when you were saying, Lauren, it's like, like what's in balance? Like, how do we, like, there's this part and there's this part, and where's the right balance? And something probably, I don't know, a lot of the things that I've learned about, especially when there's some kind of blind spot or brand new place of awareness or awakening, I like go way into it. And then it kind of like comes back, and then it kind of ends up coming to the middle, over time, something balances out, but just giving ourselves permission to continually find balance.
Yep. And there we are, back at balance.
Right. We're back at balance, and like thinking about when a whole collective is trying to find balance and what that feels like and what that means.
That's where we are.
Yeah.
And so go ahead, Shayna.
I was just going to say, and a lot of us are fighting it. And when we fight it, that's when it becomes much more painful.
Feels like that's,
so what would you, sorry.
I was just saying, it feels like that's true of everything. That just feels so true of everything.
Yeah, it is. When we fight the lesson, we fight the imbalance. We pronounce it. We, feed it. It becomes worse and painful. And that's why I talk about this divine masculine and feminine. And oftentimes people want to say, well, does that mean masculine is bad? No, masculine is beautiful and needed. It's about balance. It just truly is about balance. And how in our world right now, we're imbalanced. And we've been imbalanced for a very long time when it comes to the energies. And we're just in a state now where we're trying to come back in. We're being called into balance. And some people are really threatened and afraid of that, and afraid of losing power, and afraid of sharing power, and afraid of what that might mean, and afraid of being shamed. And it's really not a shaming. It's just about balance.
So what do you think, given where we are in consciousness right now and how that balance is swinging, what is needed to support the healing of the collective right now where we are?
Ooh, in a word, Angela Davis says it all the time: community. We have got to get in community. It's going to take, transformative relationships between people who have a common goal or a common affinity. That's one of the ways in which I've changed the way I do my work. I do a lot of our work more purposely in racial affinity groups, because so much of our world work right now is around racial healing. And what I found through doing that work with so many different people around the world now is that oftentimes the work goes deeper and it actually goes faster when people are in groups where they share racial affinity. And so I don't think that is the only way, of course. That's just one way. I think we're being called into community to be with people who share our similar kind of experiences, as well as similar growth areas and blind spots, where we can be honest, we can be vulnerable, and we can do our work in a way that doesn't harm someone else. Oftentimes when we do racial healing work in interracial settings, we've all seen it, we've all experienced, usually the people of color in the room end up doing the heavy lifting and work, and don't really get to do their own work of healing from their own internalized racism and oppression. And they, we need our own space to do that. And so, I'm just doing my part and, using my power of creating sacred spaces, and we'll continue to do that, whether it be parents or white folks or Black folks or BIPOC folks, whoever it may be. It's really calling us back into community. And making a commitment to hold each other higher into that collective accountability, and to give us grace and calls to action and commitment along the way. It's about that balance going back and forth. And when that kind of space is created, I've seen people do incredible things for themselves, for their families, for their organizations. I mean, I've seen whole organizations really change who they are. And it's beautiful. And it comes from and starts from that first kind of commitment to be in community first with themselves, with a couple other people, and be honest. You know, you mentioned something a couple conversation threads back about how I can't remember what you said, but it made me think about how we're conditioned to not tell the truth. We're conditioned oftentimes to not tell the truth about how we actually really feel about things and what we actually really want. And we need more spaces where people, for the first time, wake up to who they are, what they want, tell the truth about what they've done, tell the truth about the incongruence that's happening, so they can start making a new choice to be in congruence. Because we go so fast and so quick that oftentimes people don't even know that they even need to do that. And then once they do, it ends up being the best gift that they can give to themselves.
Well, I know that, Teach to Lead is shifting to Lead for Liberation.
It is.
And I'd love for you to just quickly talk about that name change. And I'd love if you can say the mission off the top. It's just very inspiring, and I'd love to speak it into the space.
Yes, I appreciate the question. So when I started Teach to Lead almost 9 years ago, I was fresh out of school leadership and principal development. And so it was very much an invitation for school leaders. And it was leadership development and coaching. I developed a coaching methodology for principals. And I loved doing that work at the time. And one of the competencies was cultural proficiency, another one, self-awareness. And we were the only ones really kind of popping those two out at the time. And so I would get a lot of inquiries, especially as a Black woman, like, can you just do, the cultural proficiency work? We know we really need that. And, not a lot of people really understood back then and are coming into understanding now that that is the lens through which we do everything. That's how we set direction. That's how we make our strategic plans. That's how we manage people. It's really about the lens through which, really using a liberatory lens. And so I mentioned before, I kind of fell into this 2-year period where I fell out of love with Teach to Lead. It just wasn't, I was out of congruence. I was out of alignment. The way I was doing the work wasn't kind of lining up with where I was consciously. And part of the awakening was realizing that I had gotten mucked and mired down into racism work and anti-racism work. And I am built for, future work. Like that's kind of where my mind has always been. And it's always been about liberation. And I'm like, wait a second, I'm focusing so much. And so are my clients, and asking me, focusing so much on what we don't want. We're not at all focusing enough on what we do want. And what I also discovered in that time period, speaking of feedback from the universe and from clients, I started getting inquiries from folks outside of the education sector. So nonprofits were reaching out. I connected with the Goldman folks and started traveling internationally, and started even working with some corporate clients. And through all of that, I learned how transferable the principles of leadership as well as spiritual principles are. And so I was like, okay, I got it. We're supposed to do this work in affinity. We're supposed to do this work with not just in the education sector, but with any sector, especially, we're really focusing now on organizations who want to make a social impact, who want to make a change in some way. And so there's a shift, beyond education. There's a shift in how we do the work. Instead of, working from organization to organization to organization, we're now really building out programs for people to really have that safe container and that community to grow, to call each other higher. And so Lead for Liberation is all about demystifying what liberatory cultures are, and how to operationalize them at organizations. And so our new mission is just that. We guide organizations, foundations, and communities to demystify and operationalize liberatory cultures. I've had an amazing time with you, Lauren, building out the liberatory culture continuum. It is a continuum. It's not, a binary kind of you're here or you're there. There are phases, and so many organizations are at different places depending upon what team you're talking about, depending upon what aspect of the organization you're talking about. And it really helps organizations develop a much crisper vision for what they're going for so that they're not constantly focusing on what they don't want, because then, of course, what you focus on grows. If you keep focusing on what you don't want, you're just going to keep producing that in a different way. It's just going to be dressed up. We've got to stay rooted in a state of liberation and understand and define for ourselves what that means. So that's Lead for Liberation. And I could not be more excited about it. I'm back in love. I'm reading it.
We worked through our differences. And well, I think it's like so synchronicitous that we're launching our program, The Conscious Racist, next week. And we had already planned for this podcast, to be months ago today. Yeah. And so I would love to just hear, how did you come to The Conscious Racist? Because you're doing work with Black women and you are supporting the work of white people.
I am.
So, yeah. What does that mean to you?
Oh, it means a lot of things, Lauren. So, I have mentioned part of my identity, I'm a bridge, whether I like it or not. There's something about my lifetime that I am a translator. I've always kind of been that way. I'm kind of that person in any situation that is able to see both sides. I'm able to see multiple perspectives, and I'm able to, build relationships with all kinds of people. And so I often find myself being that bridge from, one to another. And there's beauty in that. And there's also exhaustion in that. And so in doing work with Black women in the Indigo women community, it is so, I lose words. Words escape me to really describe how joy-filled, how liberating, how inspiring that work is to watch women finally have the space that they've been calling in for a long time to do the kind of development work that's really meaningful for them. And while that's I feel so liberated when I do that, I also know that I'm called to do that work with all kinds of folks. And I know what's good for and what's great for whoever's on the margins. In this case, we're talking about Black women. It's great for everyone. And so I'm now translating the beauty of what is Indigo women and also creating The Conscious Racist, which is a sacred space for white leaders who really are called and are also calling in a community of other white leaders who are doing this work. They understand it's going to require inner disruption in order to have that true, genuine outer disruption. And so I'm excited about it. I'm the visionary behind it, but I'm also not the lead facilitator, right? It's not my work to do directly. That has, really been dangerous and can be dangerous for some folks. And I know my limits. I now know my boundaries and I know where I'm to be for right now. But my job is to be a huge part, right, of creating that container. And I cannot be more excited for that container and what it's going to mean for all the leaders who come through it. And more importantly, for the people they lead, the people in their families, their communities. So I can't be more excited about it.
When I think about it, I've been thinking about, it really feels like a core body of work for me, like a life's work coming together, a culmination of so many things. And since I am facilitating, I've been thinking about if I feel like I'm speaking my intention to the universe through this experience, is that to hold an experiential container of love and liberation so that people can feel it and know it and have a sandbox of interdependent, liberated community that then they can bring that vision and even that kind of alchemical change from being in that container out into their world. And I mean, that's really what conscious leadership offered me in a lot of ways. Like different containers have offered that to me. Yeah. And because it was experiential and I got a taste, like once you get a taste of that, you can never go back to how, where you were before. It just changes you at a cellular level, I want to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Y'all hear that?
Yeah. That's the intention.
I'm so excited. Like, just to hear you talk about that, my feet are tingling. That's just, yeah. I couldn't be more excited and more like grateful that I'm in this space. It was very scary to be in a place of like not loving the organization I created for so long and not knowing why, and just kind of being in that holding pattern, to now, like, it's so clear why, and so excited about the future. And I feel lighter. It's a new chapter. Our world is in a new chapter right now. We're just in flow. And I'm just excited for what's to come.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah,
that was beautiful.
Y'all are beautiful. Thanks for creating this container. This was great.
Yeah, I'm excited for, these are the conversations I love to have, and I really appreciated your clarity. There's just a clarity and a simplification of things that can feel very complex and very overwhelming. And it's just like, oh, you mean this? I think you're talking about this topic. It's like, yes, it is.
Another one of my superpowers is synthesizing.
Yeah, synthesizing, right.
Yeah, I'm a synthesizer.
I was thinking about you, Bethany, in the shower today. And then this is coming up now, listening to Shayna. I mean, I've always known that how we talk about ourselves impacts ourselves. Like, that's obvious, but I've always focused on just not talking bad to myself. But something about both of you is you're actually pretty consistent about, like, this is my superpower. This is what I'm great at. Like, this is, and it doesn't come off as like egotistical or anything. It's just like, this is what's true. Like, this is what I know to be true. I'm reflecting that back on myself. And that is, I don't think that that's a practice that I have. And maybe I'll say it in my head, but it's definitely not something I'm speaking to other people. Like, well, I'm really good at this. And even this award ceremony I was at, like, I'm like, I haven't fully been available to be awarded. I haven't been available to receive acknowledgement of the things that I'm doing. So that's every podcast, I feel like there's messages and healing and opportunities for me. And that's one of the ones I'm taking away today.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Nice.
I'm excited for you.
All right. It feels like Friday, but it's not. So we all got to work and go be with our kids and do all kinds of things now.
Shayna.
Of course. Thank you for having me. This was great. Thank you.
All right. Good night. Bye.
Good night.
Hey everybody, if you've got any feedback for us, we welcome it, or ideas about future guests, email us at healingcollectivepod@gmail.com. Our website is thehealingcollectivepodcast.com. We are at Healing Podcast on Twitter, and we are at Healing Collective Podcast on Instagram. Special thanks to Monda Creative, who edits all of our podcasts, and Two Tall Women Productions, who produce. Thank you.